fellow ministers, head of organizations, guests, summit participants, could I welcome you to this open ministerial session of the 2013 International Transport Forum Summit on funding transport. I hope you are all having a very enriching and enjoyable experience here at the summit so far. Could I extend a special welcome today to Minister Rabah from Morocco, Minister Al-Nuaimi from the United Arab Emirates, Minister Gansuk from Mongolia, as well as Mrs. Rachel Kite, the Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank, and Eva Molnar, Director of Transport of the UNECE. Today we are all gathered to exchange with three eminent leaders of the transport sector on the question on attracting private finance and ensuring predictable table funding. On behalf of all the ITF ministers, a very warm welcome to our guest speakers, Mr. David Fass, CEO of Macquarie Group in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, Mr. Xu, Executive Director and Chairman of the Board of China Construction and Communication Group, and Mr. Temel Kotil, CEO of the Turkish Airlines. Gentlemen, we thank you so much for being with us today. We greatly look forward to a stimulating exchange with you during this session. A few initial words about the structure of the session in a few moments. In a few moments, I will have the pleasure of presenting the declaration from ministers on funding transport, just agreed by the ITF ministers in the closed ministerial session. Then, following that, I will turn the floor over to Melinda Crane, our distinguished moderator for this session, who will explain the dynamics of the discussion and how we should proceed further. But before moving forward, could I ask the Secretary General of the ITF, Mr. Jose Villegas, to say a few words of welcome. The floor is yours, Mr. Villegas.
And the microphone. Thank you, Minister Arnstad. And on behalf of all members of the International Transport Forum and its Secretariat, I wish to express my gratitude to Norway for holding the presidency this year and leading our organization through a highly productive period of transition and preparation for this year's summit on funding transport. Dear ministers, distinguished guests and colleagues, we are very pleased that so many of you have joined us today for this exchange between ministers and leaders of industry. This is the second year that the ITF member ministers have opened their session to the guests and to participants in order to broaden the exchange of perspectives and enrich the dialogue on the summit theme. Even if the topic of today's session is attracting private finance and ensuring predictable funding, we are all well aware that funding in the transport sector requires public funding as well, as this is the basis to ensure predictable funding. But it is also clear now that in many countries, resources from private side are also needed to cover the needs. In synergy with the public investment and structured for long-term stability, private financing can help ensure sustainable funding for transport sector investment and operations that optimize the benefits for the sector and the society while adequately remunerating the funding partners. As Minister Arnstad just said, we are fortunate today to be able to draw on the perspectives of our three distinguished industry leaders. And allow me to thank myself also, Mr. Fass, Mr. Zhu, and Mr. Kotil, for their presence today and for their willingness to share their experience and reflect with our ministers and summit participants on how to attract and secure private funding for the transport sector. I personally look forward to this discussion and thank you all again for your participation today. Minister Arnstad.
Thank you, Secretary General. And may I, before I go into the presentation of the declaration from the ministers, also welcome the Minister Karim Haourni from Tunisia. You are warmly welcome here today, Minister. It is now my pleasure to also present to you the declaration from ministers on funding of transport. which the ITF members ministers have just adopted this morning. As we all know, the current economic context throughout the ITF countries and more globally has highlighted the major challenges that it is today to fund the needed developments in transport sector. As demand for mobility grows, the public and the private sector must work together to seek new ways of ensuring a stable and a long-term funding for transport projects. In their 2013 declaration, ministers note, among others, how essential a reliable and integrated transport system is to economic prosperity and equitably access to goods and services. In this context, maintenance of existing and investment in new infrastructure are essential to assure a high-quality, sustainable transport system. Ministers emphasize in the declaration that funding for transport infrastructure must be aligned with the essential role for transport in the economy and in society. The aim is to secure funding for investments in and renewal, maintenance of infrastructure and services, and to facilitate private sector participation in financing investment where that is appropriate. The full declaration is now available to you here in the room, and I invite you to read it carefully and reflect on how ministers and the private sector together should take forward its conclusions. Together we should try to ensure a robust, sustainable future funding for the transport sector. For now, it is also my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, Melinda Crane, who will carry us forward for our exchange with our industry guests. Melinda, the floor is yours.
I'm going to try this one first, doesn't work. A very warm welcome to all of you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, and all delegates, and thank you very much, Minister Arnstad and Secretary General Villegas. Before I get started, let me say a brief word about technology, because you have probably noticed that we're a little short on microphones at our end of the table, and I'm hoping the rest of the microphones work, but they will work much better if you please turn your cell phones all the way off or put them on flight mode. It seems that our system here has problems if cell phones are on in the room. So may I ask you once again to please turn them off or put them on flight mode, and then we do have the hope that microphones will work. Otherwise, we're going to have to all share a rather limited number of handhelds. So that would make things much less complicated. Thank you very much for your consideration. It is an honor to facilitate an exchange that's aimed at promoting the cooperation between the private and public sectors that you have so emphatically supported with your declaration today. In the next hour and 20 minutes, we're going to be seeking to explore some of the new partnership models that Minister Arnstad mentioned, and also to identify some of those well-structured mechanisms that were referred to by Secretary General Villegas, mechanisms that can optimize the cooperation between the public and private sectors, as well as the benefits to society in general. We will start out by hearing statements from transport industry leaders, whom I will introduce in just a moment. After each of their statements, which will last for about 10 minutes, there will be a 10-minute window during which ministers are welcome to offer a comment or a question. And we have an additional period of 20 minutes for open discussion following the dialogue with the last of our three guest speakers. Please raise your flags if you wish to speak. Now, as you could hear, it is a rather brisk schedule that we have this morning, so I'll have to ask you to keep your contributions fairly brief. And what does brief mean? Well, for planned interventions, we'd be grateful if you'd keep your comments or question to 3 minutes in length. And if you'd like to make a spontaneous comment, and we do urge you to do so, we'd be grateful if you'd keep it to 2 minutes in length. Thank you very much for your consideration on timekeeping. And now it's my honor to introduce our first guest speaker. David Fass heads the Macquarie Group's operations in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He's responsible for the group's corporate advisory and capital market activities in the region. Macquarie, of course, has been a global leader in infrastructure asset management for over 17 years. David Fast, the floor is yours. Welcome to you.
Phones working? Yes, they are. I would have to stand here the whole time with the one microphone, so I'm glad. Melinda, thank you. Distinguished guests, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be here, and thank you very kindly for your introduction to speak with you this morning. It's my pleasure to speak to such a prestigious group of senior international ministers on a topic as important as financing transport infrastructure. For those of you that are not familiar with Macquarie, allow me to give you a quick snapshot of our transport credentials before I begin. For those of you that don't know, Macquarie is a publicly listed Australian bank. We have had an A rating for about 22 years. We have a market capitalization on the Australian stock market of around $15 billion. We are a leading financial institution around the world with an extensive transport infrastructure heritage. We are the largest infrastructure asset manager globally, with over $100 billion worth of assets under management. The companies that we invest in and support employ more than 32,000 employees across the region here in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. In transport specifically, we manage more than $30 billion worth of assets across seaports, toll roads, airports, and rail networks. To put a little context around that, three particular assets that we own large stakes and manage would include the APRR network of toll roads in France, consisting of nearly 1,900 kilometers and is the largest French motorway network. In Copenhagen, we are the proud owners of the airport there, which serves nearly 23 million passengers per year. And in Russia, we are the owner of Brunswick Rail, a leading rail car operating lessor with nearly 24,000 rail cars on lease to local operators. Our infrastructure fund investors and partners include global pension funds and governments from around the world. We also have a leading asset finance and lending business with a portfolio of nearly $11 billion, including a leading global aircraft lessor that owns and operates 148 jet aircraft leased to 37 operators around the world. In addition to our research and physical commodities transport capabilities, we are also one of the largest infrastructure advisory houses, as Melinda said in her introduction. For example, we are currently the lead sponsor and financial advisor on the current bid to build a new 6-lane, 1-kilometer-long toll bridge over the River Mersey in the United Kingdom. In short, I'm not standing here to talk that much about Macquarie in particular, but to give you the context of the types of things that we do and the company that we keep around the world of transportation. This is a sector that we think we know very well. We understand keenly the importance to the growth and development of countries, regions, and international trade that is provided by transport infrastructure. We are also sensitive to and understand the political nature of infrastructure that supports transportation. All major transport projects around the world have effectively been supported by a country's consumers and taxpayers in some capacity, and hence the increased scrutiny of management, budgets, delivery, and operations is very, very high. All projects along the way at some point have required government support somewhere along their life cycle in the form of planning approvals, funding guarantees, or regulation. But I think, as we probably all agree here, as outlined in the OECD's International Futures Program's investigation of the strategic transport infrastructure needs to 2030, and I'm quoting here, quality infrastructure is a key pillar, my emphasis, key pillar of international competitiveness. I've seen some recent analysis, credible analysis, that proposes that a single euro invested in transport infrastructure in countries such as France or Germany or Italy or Spain has the potential to raise the GDP of those countries by 14 euros. Now, while this may not be 100% scientifically accurate, it is at least directionally accurate. I hope you would agree. And the inherent multiplier effect of transport spending is something that I think that all governments understand how powerful the economic impact of transport spending can be on the rehabilitation or growth of developed or developing economies. As we all know, however, the challenge is that while the need for efficient infrastructure has grown exponentially with changing and shifting demographics, the public funds available to support that growth have gone in the opposite direction and have in fact shrunk. Significant budget deficits from around the region are preventing governments from undertaking economy-enhancing projects and also restrict a government's ability to maintain the existing projects that they currently own. So in an era of fiscal restraint and financing challenges, how do we actually fund transport infrastructure? Before I give you the private sector perspective on the current market situation, I want to make sure that people understand today that I'm talking about core infrastructure. Specifically, my comments are limited to roads, rail, airports, and seaports. As many of you will all know, infrastructure can broadly be defined into two particular segments, greenfield or brownfield. The investors and financing mechanisms required for either asset type are fundamentally different. So let me address them in turn, and I'll start with a few comments on brownfield transportation. There is a vast community of institutional investors who are interested in funding brownfield transportation assets, many of which were previously in government hands. This group of investors extends from operators and strategics who only invest in transport through institutional investors, such as sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, or insurance companies. And in fact, more than $30 billion was raised and committed to infrastructure funds alone in the last 12 to 18 months. This does not include the direct investments that many of the very ambitious sovereign wealth funds and pension funds are making on their own. To quantify this and to put that into context, this week the EBRD suggested that nearly $27 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars of current capital is currently held by sovereign wealth funds and institutional investors. The $30 billion that's being dedicated to infrastructure is a mere drop in the bucket. Why is that happening? This pool of capital could be much larger, and it's available to invest in international transport assets based on the predictability and stability of the returns of these assets. The traditional options for long-term investors, like the equity market and the fixed income markets that are offering effectively zero return today, are just no longer attractive investments for these long-term investors to be making. Given the nature of these assets, all of these investors understand the need to be responsible. They should understand that ownership of transports needs to meet internationally acceptable standards every day. Investors also understand that ownership of these assets requires a degree of reinvestment into the businesses in terms of maintenance, expenditure, and incremental capital renewal. Operators understand that failing to reinvest in these businesses leaves investors exposed to substantial reputational risks, as users and consumers have significantly high expectations for service provisions, including safety and reliability at the top of the list. From the private sector's perspectives, our key observations about funding for brownfield infrastructure are that businesses with a track record of performance have no trouble attracting funding today. In Europe, in particular, in spite of what we read in the newspaper, we have had no issues in raising debt or equity for these types of assets in recent years. And governments don't really need to do much else in order to raise debt or equity or to continue to attract that type of investment into these types of projects. In fact, what I think is really happening is that some positive trends are emerging. Pension funds are increasing their allocation and their asset allocation benchmarks to infrastructure funds and increasing the supply of capital from where it is today. That $30 billion that I talked about earlier is going in one direction, and that's higher. This trend has been led by the Australian and the Canadian pension fund industry, which currently invests upwards of 15% of their available capital into infrastructure projects. The U.S. and European pension funds, on the other hand, are hovering around 2 or 3% and have ambitions to grow, but haven't been moving as rapidly as they would like. Given the size of most transport projects, debt is a key element in order to generate returns, and we continue to see strong support from traditional bank markets and the international capital markets to finance large, high-quality transport infrastructure assets. For the governments that are assembled here today, this should give you great confidence in the interest of private capital in acquiring strong assets and as a possible source of future growth going forward. Work being undertaken by the OECD around high-level principles on long-term investing by institutional investors is entirely relevant to this type of asset and is to be commended on its sensible recommendations. The biggest challenge at the moment is greenfield infrastructure and greenfield transportation. And many people, notably politicians and economists, extol the virtues of nation-shaping greenfield transport projects to kickstart an economy and provide much-needed stimulus to employment. Our experience, however, has shown that patronage-based, non-regulated greenfield transport projects with no government support or guarantees are rarely viable for the private sector on a standalone basis. And this is where governments, I think, can make an important contribution by refining their lists of what's available and providing well-structured projects with an appropriate amount of government support. Encouragingly, there are many examples around the world where governments and the private sector have collaborated and achieved that interwovenness to use proven financing structures that are now well known internationally. These structures involve the provision of government guarantees or government subsidies for significant projects, which just cannot be delivered without external private capital. Providing that structural support to the financing of major transport investments ensures that they become viable and that the stimulus that can result from them becomes achievable. Without this government support, the question of funding is a difficult one for the private markets. Equity and debt providers find it very difficult to justify funding a greenfield project which is not immediately economically viable on a standalone basis. Working in partnership, however, there are funding solutions which can be beneficial to all parties. And by enshrining the interests of the public at the center of any project and assisting with the long-term viability of these projects, governments play an essential role in attracting private capital for large-scale projects. A final point worth noting for this audience is the interlinked nature of brownfield to greenfield and what that transition and what that journey is all about. Following the construction and ramp-up stage of any major project, a government's role as long-term owner or guarantor is not required on a long-term basis. Many projects around the world have followed this map. For example, this is what happened when the United Kingdom sponsored the high-speed rail link between London and Dover. The private sector placed clear value on the low-risk nature of the asset following extensive government subsidies during the construction phase of the rail link. By supporting and delivering major projects and then exiting these projects at an appropriate moment, governments will be able to recycle a finite pool of capital from asset to asset. By doing so, governments can support additional higher-risk projects where there is a genuine need for assistance and encourage long-term and patient capital to invest in those assets that have already become operational. Thank you very much for your time and for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today. I look forward in the remaining moments, Melinda, to listening to some of your comments or to answering any questions that you might have of me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David Fass, for those comments. I'll just get the question started, if I may, by asking you to say a bit more on the subject of that pool of private capital. You said there is a very large pool available, and it could be larger still. You've also told us the private sector understands infrastructure and likes infrastructure. So why isn't that private capital getting deployed at a larger scale and a faster rate?
Melinda, thank you for the question. I think there really are two pieces to the answer there, and I'll try to give them quickly. I think the first is the toing and froing and governments not really knowing in all cases sort of what the appropriate way and the appropriate pace with which to approach the private sector in order to attract that type of private capital. Those points that I made at the end with respect to attracting money into greenfield projects and needing government support is probably the critical message that I wanted to leave with you today. But more importantly, or perhaps more importantly, as I have spent a lot of time around Europe with particular interest in the United Kingdom, I have found that at the center of government, central governments seem to understand this message very clearly. The problem is that as you get out into different regions or different cities or different areas of individual countries, the local governments are not working nearly with the pace and the intensity that we think the private sector needs to see, and being flexible enough to allow those types of projects to come to fruition. I think the real challenge is the desire of what I would call that wall of capital that really does want to invest in these projects. It gets as far as the capitals of countries, and it just doesn't seem to be able to flow into the regions where it really is needed.
Thank you very much for that. Excellencies, dear ministers, we are looking for comments or questions, so if you would like to offer one, please do wave your flags. I'm looking around our table. We've got plenty of questions over here, so we'll keep on going if we don't see any flags go up into the air. You mentioned risk in your final comment. David Fass, I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that. One of the perceptions that we've heard in several discussions about cooperation between the public and private sector concerns the difficulty of correctly allocating the risk burdens. What kind of initiatives and mechanisms have you seen out there to do that effectively?
I think, Melinda, your question is the question that needs to be asked almost every day, and I think people need to approach these types of interplays between the private and the public sector with the price of risk kind of being on the top of every paper that we want to talk about. I think the private capital markets are rational. They behave rationally most of the time. Most fund managers and asset managers understand risk transfer and that there is a cost to risk. And I think if there is something that needs to be brought to bear, is that it needs to be that risk sharing, or what the cost of that risk, or when there is transference of risk, that people understand that there is a cost benefit around risk sharing. And I think oftentimes the reason that some of these things stall is that there is just not an honest discussion, both ways, of what risks are inherent and what can change about risks. I just looking around the table, I know that nearly everybody in this room has been around in positions where risk has really mattered over the last 5 years. There's no doubt that we've gotten it wrong many times. We've also gotten it right many times. And I think what's happened is that there is too much of risk loading on one side of the table or the other. And I think that if we started each discussion around capital allocation and which projects we're going to move into privatization land or PPP land, and talked very clearly about where the risk spikes are, what the ability is to mitigate those risks, who is in a best position to mitigate those risks, and if they can't be mitigated, about what those risks are worth, and then figure out from a return perspective who should be bearing those risks. It just needs to become a much more commercial and honest dialogue as opposed to a black box and let's not talk about it till the very end dialogue.
Thank you very much. Here we have a question from the sorry, there's a
Mexico.
cameraman in front of you. Moldavia, I believe it
Mexico,
is. Yes.
I think.
Please. Mexico, excuse me.
Thank you. I'm José San Martín from Mexico. Now I'm the General Director of the Mexican Transport Institute, and I run the program of PPP for toll roads, work very close to Macquarie in that issue. And talking about risks, could you give us some examples in your opinion, what type of risks can the private sector take? What type of risks should the government take, and which ones could be shared?
Thank you very much for your question. I think the question really relates to risk identification and how that risk gets dealt with. I think one thing that should be very clear is that as any of these PPP projects, whatever they happen to be, as they go through their development stage and then onto their in-use stage, the risks change. And I think one of the challenges, the issues that I've seen, is that we all try to sit around our computer models and decide what those risks are up front. We try to price those all up front, and we assume that they're going to stay the same during the life of a project. And I think, Mr. General Director, what I think needs to happen, as I said earlier, is I think there just needs to be a more genuine approach to, in toll roads, for example, there's usually this big topic and this big dialogue around traffic risk and then toll risk. And it's very difficult for you to know in your position, and very difficult for us as advisors or providers of capital to really know when we put in a toll road exactly what percentage of the people are going to move and what type of tolls are going to be and incentives are going to work for the population during that time. And so I guess my suggestion would be that we have a more open dialogue and not necessarily a framework that dictates that we're going to have certain traffic numbers per year that are going to be minimum guaranteed by governments. I think that the equity providers should be willing to take some of that risk, not all of that risk. And so it really comes down, I think, to having a more constructive dialogue around risk sharing of inflation metrics, GDP metrics, and in the example of toll roads, but it can be applied more broadly, usage metrics in general.
Thank you very much. We also have time for one comment from India. A hand microphone is coming to you.
Hello. You mentioned about the lack of risk or you can say risk averse in the infrastructure long-term pension funds. You mentioned a figure of 15% and a figure of 2%. In India, we have also found that the pension funds have been generally risk averse. What do you think should be a policy framework whereby these pension funds, which are pensions of people who get old and therefore they would like to have a reasonable degree of safety for them. So what policy framework should governments adopt, you feel, which will encourage them to increase their share? Because they are very critical for the long-term investments in all infrastructure which are 20 years or 25 years important.
Thank you very much, sir. I use the Australian and the Canadian, the Australian framework and the Canadian framework in some of my earlier comments, and I believe that the dialogue that exists between pension regulators and insurance regulators in each individual country or each individual region is a dialogue that you folks at ministerial level ought to be having with finance ministers and banking regulators and insurance regulators in your individual countries. I believe in Australia, when the superannuation pension reform was introduced, it was introduced alongside some treasury reform and some regulatory reform in the banking and the insurance sector that assured that if savers and workers were going to be forced to save more money, and they wanted to be able to deploy that money over a long term in an inflation-hedged environment, as you say, for 15 or 20 or 30 years. And as we get older and older, I think we're starting to think about 40 and 50-year needs that pensioners will have. That type of regulation and that type of policy reform needs to be integrated and needs to come out of the ground in connection with the regulators, not just the Transport Ministry or the Energy Ministry making its own independent decisions. It has to work together with finance, treasury, and regulations as well.
David Fast, thank you very much. You
My
are
pleasure.
welcome to return to your seat.
Thank you all very much.
And I'm pleased now to introduce our second guest speaker. Mr. Georgie Chang is chairman of the board of the China Construction and Communications Company, the largest port construction and design company in China, as well as a market leader in road, bridge, and railway construction. Mr. Zhou previously served as chairman of the board of the China Road and Bridge Construction Company. It's a great honor to have you with us, Mr. Zhou.
Dear Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my pleasure to share with you some of my views based on the experience of our company, China Communications Construction Company, on the topic of governments should encourage and attract more private capital to participate in the development of transportation infrastructure. My presentation will cover the following contents. The role of infrastructure in the economical development, common situation of infrastructure in the developing countries, how governments can encourage and attract more private investment in infrastructure, some information about CCCC and China in transportation infrastructure. First of all, let's have a look at the role of transportation infrastructure in the economic development. I would define the transportation infrastructure as a fundamental industry, and it plays an important role in economic growth due to its great impact on the economic activities of other industries. For instance, develop the transport infrastructure, contribute to the better combination of essential production factors, contribute to the increase of capital circulation and reduction of production costs, improve production efficiency, enhance a nation's competitiveness in the international market. The transportation infrastructure plays an important role in the economic growth because that it is vital for industrialization acceleration as a large-scale industrialized production needs perfect transport facilities, and urbanization is closely related to the transport modernization. It is significant to regional poverty elevation to be prosperous, build roads first, has become the consensus of the Chinese public because they evidenced that it offers free mobility of people, logistics, and information. It offers more job opportunities, and the local agriculture products have easy access to the markets for the better value. On the other hand, inadequate transportation infrastructure is a common situation in the developing countries. And such situation is seriously bottlenecking the economic growth. It is not exceptional to find in developing countries that transport network is far from being adequate, with many places inaccessible. Low standard of transport facilities resulting in poor efficiency. Limited means of transportation with low level of comprehensive transport capacity. Among all other reasons, the most critical reason leads to such inadequate infrastructure is the extensive dependence on the insufficient public funds, either in short term or long term, to invest in infrastructure sector. Then, what's the solution for such a situation? I believe the very fundamental way lies in market-oriented reforms. for investment and financing. Governments should encourage and attract the private sector and foreign capital in the development of transportation infrastructure to tackle the problem of fund shortage and to accelerate the development of transportation infrastructure. However, there are certain conditions to satisfy when you want to attract private investment. For instance, legislation protection for private investment should be in place. Government may offer some kind of encouragement, such as tax incentive, government subsidies, and such. Private investors may seek for risk-sharing mechanism through government guarantee or other policy support. In China, BT and BOT are the most commonly used business models. When private capital invests in the transportation infrastructure, under BT model, the private investor will fund and build the facility, and the government is obliged to buy it back with certain time limit, normally by providing a buyback guarantee. On a BOT model, the private investor normally forms a SPV to fund, build, and operate the facility and be responsible for debt repayment. The government normally takes the burden of land acquisition and relocation. However, it is quite often subject to the revenue capability of the project. The government may offer some type of compensation, subsidies, or support as government encouragement, such as land compensation, extension of concession period, tax incentive, fixed revenue in conjunction with toll charge, permission of refinancing in capital market. CCCC is the third largest highway investor and operator in China. We have done projects with various business models, both in BT and BOT. Up to date, CCCC owns 25 concessions of expressway in China, with total length of 1,710 kilometers and a total investment of 134 billion yuan, equivalent to 22 billion US dollars. Here are some examples. Guizhou to Duyun Expressway is typical concession of 30 years. The total length is 81 kilometers with total investment of 7.5 billion yuan in BOT plus EPC model. Another 30-year concession project, Xianying to Tongshan Expressway in Hubei province. The government offers a land lot of 107 acres as compensation and provides tax incentive to corporate tax exemption for the first 3 years and 50% exemption for another 3 years, starting from the year of profit making. Yanhou to Daqing Expressway in Guizhou province. It's also 30 years concession. The government provide 35% of project fund in installment as per work progress. Ladies and gentlemen, China has carried out serious reforms in investment and financing system of transportation infrastructure so as to diversify business model and attract investment from different sectors. By 2012, China has built 98,000 kilometers of expressways, of which less than 20% was funded by the central government, and more than 8% were funded by the private capital and the local government. It effectively resolved the problems faced by infrastructure development as constraint to the economic growth. Some of our practice could be useful reference to the other developing countries. We would be glad to exchange and discuss with different governments on the issue to achieve transportation infrastructure development. Thank you very much, and a very good morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zhou, for your remarks. I'll just get questioning started, if I may, and please do be advised, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, that we will be hearing answers in Chinese, so please do put on your translation headsets now, if you would. Mr. Zhou, we know that your company is also very actively involved in the Asian market, the biggest contractor in the Asian market. I wonder if you would tell us something briefly about that. And given that our summit is devoted to the topic of funding this year, also the question for those activities in other markets, investment in infrastructure in other markets, to what degree is there financial support available from your government, given that it does hold very, very large foreign currency reserves?
Sorry, I haven't a good question. I just answer your question in Chinese. 中国交建呢，除了在
In addition
中国
to
投资建设高速公路以外，
investment
基础设施
projects
我
regarding
们
the
现在
highway
也在世界
construction in
级发展
China,
的国家
CCCC also
这
carry
个
out a lot of
通过
projects
投
out of
资
China.
加强合作，共同
And
来推
we
进
have
发展
focused
中
on
国家
our
的交通基
cooperation
础设
with
施建设。
other
比如
companies
说
and
我们在牙
governments.
买加投资了
For
南北
example,
高
in
速公路，
Jamaica,
这
we
也
have
是一
invested
条
a
BOT 项目。
expressway
那么
project on the
我们
BOT
还在
mode.
其他国家进
In
行
other
一些港
countries,
口、公
we
路、桥
also
梁
carry out a
和
lot
基
of
础设施
projects
建
with
设。
regard to port
那么
construction.
同时，中国政府也非常支持中国的企业
At the
在
meantime,
发
the
展中
Chinese
国家
government is very
这个
supportive of
帮
Chinese
助
companies to
基
go
础设
out
施的建设。
and to
那
get
么，中
involved
国
in
政
a
府
lot
的
of
支持呢，一个是呢
transport
通过一些
infrastructure construction
优惠贷款项目，
outside of China.
比如比较低的利息。那么
And
第二个
the
呢，中
government
国的
has
商业银
also
行
provided a lot of
也积极
encouragement
通过融资的方式
to our
支
companies,
持
for
中
example,
国的企业
to have
在
a
发展
lower
中国家
tax
通
levy
过投资
policy
行为帮助发展中国家进一
and
步完善基础
also
设施建设。
give a lot of support for our company to carry out a lot of project construction in some other developing countries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zhou. I had a comment from the German minister, Mr. Ramsauer.
Sie haben in Ihrem In your contribution, you have mainly talked about private funding of road projects, and before we've heard about ports, for example. So what are your experiences when it comes to the private funding of railroad infrastructure? Do you also think this is possible?
中国呢是在公路市场最早进行投融资体制的改革，所以中国经过差不多近30年的
And I would like to mention that in early 1980s, China began to have a lot of policy reform with regard to the funding policies in transport. So we have gained the experience of about 30 years.
现在中国政府正在采取措施，
And
把
now
政府和企业
China
进
is
行
now
分开。
carrying
我
out a
想
lot of
中国在
initiatives
铁路投
to
融资体制方
integrate
面
private sector
可能
into
下步
the
将会积
funding
累
policy.
更多的经验。因为
And
我们还没
with
有参
regard
与
to
铁
the
路
funding
投资，
in the
所以
rail
我
field,
们也没有铁路方面
the
的
Chinese government is now still accumulating relevant experience. And for my company, CCCC, we are not have sufficient experience with regard to the rail funding.
Thank you very much, Minister Ramsauer and Mr. Zhou. Do I have
谢谢周
other comments
先生。
from our ministers?
谢-
Questions, comments? Raise your flags, please. Okay, then I think that we will thank you very much, Mr. Zhou, for that, and you may please return to your seat. Thank you.
Thank you.
And it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Temel Kotil. He is CEO of Turkish Airlines. Dr. Kotil sits on the Board of Governors of the International Air Transport Association and on the Board of Governors of the Association of European Airlines, and he will serve as chairman of that association starting next year. Welcome to you, Dr. Kotil. The floor is yours.
Thank you, dear President. Thank you, all the ministers, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to talk about our experience on the airline part on the funding issues. If you allow me, I have a chart. Ladies and gentlemen, the chart you are seeing here right now is the worldwide airline travel in the 1 year. So as an airline, we're making about $671 billion US. This is from the cargo and passenger only. And we're carrying about 3.1 billion passengers. And dear Minister, think about that airline business is not healthy. It's not making profit. And we are not growing. And we are not offering lower fares. I believe this development in this world will be really slowed down very, very badly. Dear ministers, when we take off from the airports, we feel like we are in the air, we are free. We can go any places. But sometimes, because of the regulation, we need to do some zigzags, not a straight line. This means we're spending more fuel. Really also is not good for nature, but it's not good for our budget, which is being the problem on the funding issues. So, dear Minister, we're asking, make the air more straight, you know. Also, I'm in Europe, the board members, we're asking also the Minister in Europe, please, you know, finalize that single European skies because we don't have enough money to fund our aircrafts. Dear Minister, I will continue from here, but I just need to remind the number you're seeing that $671 billion US need to multiply by this 5. That's the contribution to the industries. Last thing why you said that as a Turkish airline, we are expanding very heavily. I will bring a few examples later on. Let's say in Africa, we're flying so many cities there. Trade between Turkey and Africa last 3 years did increase 10%, increase about 10 times because of service there. So I will finalize this way. Airline business is very important, dear Minister, because this activity is also all the transports. But we need your support very badly. not finance our investment, but make our life easier on the air, on the ground. I will come back later on, is these issues. Dear Minister, dear guests, what we are seeing here, this is the amount of money we need to spend every year to finance our aircraft. When talking about the funding of the aviation, that's the funding of the aircraft. Actually, don't assume the aircraft is very expensive, although Boeing Airbus is selling very expensively. But this is because you pay them on the deliveries. Just like do simple mathematics, you know, aircraft about $120 million. This is a mid-size, big aircraft, not the biggest one, not the smallest one. That $120 million need to pay on the deliveries, so we need the funding about this one. But same aircraft in the same year is consume about same amount of money, $120 million roughly. That's the fuel, that's the labor cost, that's the catering, that's the maintenance issues. We fund this one about 12 years. So this means about 10% cost coming to funding the aircraft, about 9%, 10%. Rest is all the spending we're doing. But we're selling tickets, we're getting income, and we're paying it. The funding of aircraft became difficult because you pay on deliveries. So when you're visiting the private companies funding, this is what we are doing, because airline business is a global, airline business is a private, airline business needs a private funding. They're asking you, are you healthy or not? Are you going to pay this money in 12 years period? So aircraft is not costly, it's 10%, but because if they're checking we are not healthy, that time we have problems to buy it. What's the dilemma we're having nowadays on the airline business? Aircraft we are using is pretty old as an average. It's about 15, 20 years plus. And the economic life, some of them, I'm not talking about all of them, of course, they're not good shape. And some big companies doesn't have enough economic strength go to get the funding from banks and buy new one, which is less, is cheaper in the full consumption, is better for this one, this one, this one. That's the dilemmas. And I will continue, that's the Turkish Airlines. We already spent about $8.4 billion from 2003 on, financed our aircraft, and about more coming, about 20 billion investing coming. So in order we do it, we should be healthy. We need to make profit. In order we need to make profit, we need to work very hard, of course. We need to cost cut. No matter for the fact. We should bring the best product possible on the market, you know. But believe me, I'm in this business 10 years. If I work 25 hours a day, if your minister does not support us in the way it's supposed to be, there is no way we can make profit. If there is no profit, there is no private funding. There is no private funding, there is no new aircraft. If there is no aircraft, it's more costly. This is like that circle, you know, that end for us. Turkey growing very fast. I will give the Turkey as an example because it's a nice example. We grow, thanks to our minister here, Minister Binali Yildirim, and in Turkey investing very heavily from governments on the ground. We are airline, we work on the air. When our passengers coming to airports, they have the problems on the boarding and checking at nice airports. That time we lost about 40% of it, but cost of the airport is about 5%. So if your minister somehow private or the government didn't fix the airport issues, we lost the 40% of the feeling on the passengers. On the air, we love our passengers, but this is that end for us. This is why on the ground there should be a lot of investment. So what's happening in our examples? You heard about it. Our Minister of Transport has the new tenders and the contract signed. It's about 10 billion euros investment on the greenfield and new airport. This is one of the largest. And hopefully starting by 2017 in operation. And also 26 billion euro will be going to receive from the greenfield as an income for the 25 years. We're going to say that, okay, guys, we're going to increase the cost of the Turkish airline. But we prefer it. If you have the excellent airports, we're targeting by 2020, 100 million passengers for the Turkish airline. If you have an excellent airport, we can pay for it. Because it's 40%, 5%, The feeling is 40%, cost is 5%. It's became 1 point out, that's okay. And also at the same time, we're investing $20 billion on the aircrafts. So it's bundled. So that's my last message here. This is our networks. And our last message is, as a ministry, you need to don't think we are a cash cow. Sort of saying this one. Airline business is not a very easy business. And 40% of the feeling on the ground, we don't have no control at all. We need to buy new aircraft, and that's the private funding. Because we are a private company, airline most is private. But in private funding is not became very expensive. Only the way is we are healthy. In order we become healthy, make our road on the air straight line, and help us on the infrastructure side. This because we are not that business. And this way, hopefully, and you will have the best service worldwide, globally, and all the economies, includes every countries, will grow. And last week I said that growth in the airline business about 5%, population 1%. By 2050, everybody in this world, 7 billion, maybe 8 billion that time, will be travel. So airline business will be more important than today, and build infrastructure for the 2050s. And thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kut. A brief follow-up question to you as well. If I can briefly summarize what we heard there, what you're saying is that in your industry, what you're looking for from the public partner is not so much a funding stream, but on the ground, regulation, policy that makes your business more efficient and basically increases your profits. So given the fact that you are one of the world's most international airlines, how would you compare what's happening in that respect in the markets that you serve in Europe as compared to other places?
Yeah, and we're serving all the markets as a Turkish airline, including Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, Africa, on the Atlantic side of also the Asia, you know. So what we are seeing is people moving more, traveling more, mostly less developed countries in Africa, let's say, and be focusing very heavily there. That's the investment also making very heavily there. And this showing that the world is normalizing more. Every part of the world will get more active on the ever travel. This means that the business actually. If people is traveling, they are doing business, they're traveling for culture, they're traveling so many good things. And this is a normalization worldwide. And what we are seeing also that less developed countries may be very heavily investing compared to developed one. And also I need to make this comment, airport, at this FE airport in every single country need to operate 24 hours because life is 24 hours. Mathematics is very simple. If you're flying to the west, you need to go early morning. If you're flying to the east, you need to go to very late night, you know. That's the efficient, that's the people want to travel. And combine all that thing is world changing a lot of the different things coming out. But we need every single country's airport going to serve until 2050s.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We have a planned intervention from Turkey, and I see Tunisia would also like to speak. Turkey?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And regarding funding transportation, it is the main topic of this year ITF forum. After global crisis, the funding of transport infrastructure become very crucial and important subject. So the needs of the people is go on, and the resources is not enough. This happen always. So you cannot meet all financing by general budget. So we have to find way that the funding rather than general budget, PPP models, BOT models, and others. So in order to do this, first you need the legal infrastructure, which can attract global investors, global funding institutions to invest. So then you should have a proper, profitable, reliable project. And then you have to form the risk-sharing structure, which means BOT or PPP project. You have two parties. One party is government in general, the other party is investors, and the third party is financing institutions. So you should organize agreement and all document such a way that the risk sharing should be fair. Otherwise, the project will not be attractive, nobody will show interest. So last 6 to 10 years in Turkey, we implement very successfully these financing models, PPP and BOT project. Mainly airports, 10 concessions we successfully completed. Last one is completed in the beginning of May. The total worth about the project, $46 billion. This is going to be one of the biggest airport in Istanbul, and this is done. We delivered a greenfield land, and they will build a big airport, and they will operate 25 years after construction, and they deliver back to government. So altogether, and highways, bridges, underwater tunnels, some 20 big projects is being financed by the BOT or PPP models. The total amount of $48.5 billion. So that is a good example. We are ready to share our experience to everybody around here. And I conclude that the ITF is doing a lot to make transport more effective, more cooperative among the countries, as well as among the region. So ITF role is becoming crucial for the future in freeing transport and removing all barriers in front of transport, because transport is not a trade, not is an economical activities itself. The transport is a means of increasing trade, tourism, economic activities among the nations. So that is very important. Whatever you try to form for the future, we keep in mind that transport should be free any barriers. So I would like to thank the host country, Dr. Peter Ramsauer, for a nice hosting facilities. Also, President Norway, Minister, thank you very much, your presidency. It was a very great organization. Being the first experienced minister organizing this forum outside my country in Leipzig in year 2009, it was that time the first experience. I see that things are moving and improving. The next organizers, like France and New Zealand and Vice President of Copenhagen, I wish good luck to them. And Secretary General, Mr. Villegas, we appreciate your work done last 9 months. And you put a very great vision for the ITF work, and we will be supporting continuously in order to improve. This is, so to say, is Davos in transport. We have to promote this forum and this organization, which is essential for global economy. If there is no transport, there is no life at all. So thank you very much for your support, and thank you for all of you. Good luck for the future, all of us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister Yildirim. I have a comment from Tunisia.
Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. C'est un événement pour la Tunisie.
Thank you very much for the invitation for Tunisia. This is indeed something quite special to be part of this forum. And for Europe, it is a step towards Africa. It's an opening. In Tunisia, we have a nice example of cooperation with Turkey. It is based on the construction of an airport. It's a BOT model, build, operate, and transfer, that is, and there are more than 20 million passengers on this airport. Up until now, we only have 10 million inhabitants, so this is about our strategic geographic position and location that we want to use. And now I would like to ask a question to our colleague from Turkey. On June 26th, Tunisia will start negotiations with the European Union. The target is the Open Sky Agreement, and I would like to know now what kind of position the Turkish transport or aviation company has vis-à-vis Open Sky with Europe and Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that comment from Tunisia. We will now ask Dr. Kotil, with many, many thanks, to return to his... Would you like to comment briefly on the remark?
No, actually, this is the ministerial level. Maybe our minister would comment on it. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. And we will now move on to our general discussion. And I do have several registered comments already on our general discussion. But first, if you would, please, a warm round of applause for Dr. Kotil. So thank you very much. And I would now like to ask New Zealand for its comments.
Thank you. And indeed, it was actually a question to Dr. Kotil, if I could just extend that to you. Yes. Doctor, you mentioned the importance of government making it easier for airlines to fly in straight lines. And I presume you're making a connection to the International Civil Aviation Regulatory Regime. It's been around for about 70 years, and it's based on bilateral agreements. So what changes do you think are needed to the regulatory regime so that they're going to be fit for purpose over the next 30 years or so?
And actually, of course, aircraft are designed to fly the straight lines. And because of the maybe sometime, I don't know, they're saying the sensitive areas, because of that airport approach, small things, but make us out of cost, 40% of the cost is the fuel. 1% improvement there is 0.4% in the EBITDA margin, It's a big money. Of course, 1% could be done very easily. That's why maybe all the ministers are here, and they should be straight line. And also you go earlier, there's 1,000 things, and there's no benefit in our understanding. We don't know the policy maybe too much, but we know the airline business very well. It should be helpful there. And airline business is a must for the future, and making life easier for the aircraft, make the life easier for everybody. That's basically. Okay.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kotil, you may return to your place because, in fact, you have a hand microphone at your place. And, dear ministers, you are welcome to address a question to any of the CEOs. They do have the ability to answer at their seats. So I do have now a question from Russia. Federation of Russia.
Тоже воспользуюсь возможностью сделать выступление на русском языке, поскольку с этого года
русский язык является официальным языком нашего форума. Буквально несколько слов, поскольку в течение 3 минут невозможно характеризовать при таких больших размерах Well,
страны
of
и
course,
ее
3
транспортной системы,
minutes, so there is
инвестиционную
not really
привлекательность и
much
возможность
context you
привлечения
can
частных
give,
инвестиций.
especially if you take a look at
Одно
the
хочу
Russian
сказать, что
situation and the
сегодня
state of development
уровень
of our transport
экономического развития
structure.
уже
We have
достиг
very interesting
пределов
investment
возможностей
projects and a lot of
транспортной
possibilities.
системы, и
All I
те
basically want to say
инфраструктурные
that the level
ограничения,
of
которые
our
у нас
economic
есть, они уже
development
сдерживают
is rather
дальнейшее развитие
positive, and the
экономики.
limitations
Правительство
and
страны,
reservations that
безусловно,
we
это
have
видит
in our
и
country
предпринимает
do
необходимые
pose
шаги.
an obstacle for
И
further
несмотря на то,
development.
что
The government is aware of this fact, and the
сегодня
government tries to make the
транспортная
steps
система
required.
работает на пределе, мы
The
ставим перед собой
transport
еще
system in
большие
Russia
задачи, увеличив
has
и
met
мобильность
its
населения в
limits,
1,5
so to
раза до
speak, but
2020 года,
nevertheless, we try
авиационную
to
подвижность даже в 2 раза,
enhance
и
mobility
увеличив
of our
мощность
population
российских
by a factor
портов
of
тоже
1.5
примерно на
in order
50%.
to
А также
support
понимаем,
mobility.
насколько
We want
необходимо
to
развитие
support
дорожной
mobility
сети,
with airports. We
и
want to increase their
поставлена
capacity
задача
by
об
50%.
увеличении
And we
в 2
also
раза
are aware of the importance of developing road networks.
строительства
That
дорог.
has led us in
И
our
все это, конечно,
nation
невозможно
to
без
pose the
участия частного
challenge
капитала,
of doubling
поскольку
the
мы
existing
оцениваем
road network.
объем
Of course,
инвестиций,
all these
необходимый в
projects can
развитие
hardly be
транспортного комплекса до
implemented
2020
without
года
private
в
capital.
пределах 300
Until
миллиардов
2020,
евро.
we estimate that there will be
Для
investments of
этого,
approximately 300 billion
развивая, так сказать,
euros.
тезисы
In
моих
order to
коллег, и в первую
solve
очередь
this
содержащиеся
task, I would
выступления
like to
министра
enlarge
транспорта
upon
Турции
the
господина
statements
Налива
that have
Дурдыма,
already
мы
been
также
made here, amongst
создаем
others
необходимую
by our
законодательную
friend,
базу,
the
и у
minister
нас
from
сегодня
Turkey.
есть
We
в качестве
also work
основы
on
и
a
закон
regulatory
о концессионных
basis.
соглашениях. В этом
And,
году
for
мы примем закон
example,
о
we
государственно-частном
have
партнерстве.
implemented
Созданы
a
необходимые
concession
институты,
agreement. We
внешэкономбанк,
will pass a law
специальный
on
инвестиционный
public-private
фонд
partnerships
для
this
развития
year,
инфраструктуры,
and
дорожный
the
фонд,
Foreign Economy Bank
государственная
is an
компания,
institution
занимающаяся
involved in that.
развитием
We have
федеральных дорог.
established a road
Также
fund.
другие
We
механизмы
have
поддержки, а
government
самое главное,
means that
на
take a
федеральном
look into
уровне,
the
на уровне
development of the
министерства
national
и
road
на
network, and
уровне
we have all
региональных
kinds of other
правительств
support
сформированы
mechanisms. It is also
профессиональные
important that on
команды,
a
которые
federal level, on the
смогут
level of
на
federal
одном языке
ministries and
разговаривать
regional ministries,
с
we
частными
establish
инвесторами
professional
и,
teams. And we
разбираясь
have
в
put
различных моделях
together
финансирования,
professional teams that
предлагать
speak the same
наиболее оптимальные
language,
формы
that are able to
государственно-частного
speak with
партнерства.
investors,
Мы,
and
так же
they
как
have an
и в
in-depth
Турции,
knowledge of different
видим
financing and
одно
funding
из
models, and
основных
hence they are aware
направлений,
of
привлекательных
the
направлений
necessity
для
of
частных
PPP
инвестиций
models and are
строительство
capable of
новых
implementing them.
терминальных комплексов в
Turkey is
авиации.
also an
И
interesting
здесь
country
уже
for
в
us.
этом году в
In
Петербурге
Turkey,
будет
new terminals
введен
were built, which is a very interesting
современный
opportunity for
терминал
private capital. And in
мощностью
St.
примерно
Petersburg, for example, a
18
very modern
миллионов
terminal
пассажиров
will be
в год
commissioned this year.
без копейки
It will be able to handle
бюджетного
approximately
финансирования.
17 million
Проект
passengers
реализуется
per
на
year,
принципах государственно-частного
and
партнерства, и,
there is
наверное,
not
это один
one
из показательных
piece
примеров
of
сегодня
government
в Европе.
money in that.
Вчера
All
на
that
круглом
has been
столе
carried out
выступал
within the framework of
по
public-private
вопросам
partnerships, and I think
развития
it is a
скоростных
model
железных
project
дорог,
for
и в
Europe
наших
as
планах
well.
тоже
Yesterday, we
строительство
talked about high-speed
более
railways at
3,5
a
тысяч
table, at a
километров
plenary,
высокоскоростных
and I also
железнодорожных
talked about our
путей.
plans to
И
build
здесь мы
more than
также понимаем, что
3,000
такой
kilometers
амбициозный
of
проект может быть
high-speed rail
реализован
tracks.
исключительно на
Here
принципах
as well, we
государственно-частного
see that it's
партнерства,
an ambitious
конечно, с
project
серьезным
that can only be carried out on a PPP
федеральным
basis.
бюджетным грантом.
Of
Также мы
course, this
планируем
also
и
means
1500
that
километров платных
support will
дорог
be
ввести
needed,
до
funding will be needed
2020
on the basis
года,
of federal
и все
means.
это тоже потребует
We also
безусловного
will build more than
участия
3,000
наших
kilometers
инвесторов
of
и
roads with
внебюджетных
a toll
источников
system,
финансирования.
and these are our
Таким образом,
long-term or
мы
medium-term targets. All
видим и
these
концентрируем
targets are to be reached, amongst
конкретные
others, with the
проекты
help of
для
private
реализации
money.
и, естественно,
Hence, we
обеспечивая
also see
единые
very hands-on
транспарентные правила игры,
concrete projects that we are currently
планируем на
implementing, and we
то,
also
что
try to
эти проекты
establish
найдут сегодня
transparent,
своих
fair
инвесторов,
rules.
и
We hope
этот инвестиционный
and
интерес
we
будет
are
реализован
planning
и
to
материализован
find
в конкретной
private investors, and we
инфраструктуре.
hope
Тем
that
более,
these
что
projects
сегодня
are attractive enough for
транспорт
private
создает
investors.
примерно 7% ВВП нашей страны.
Transport transport today accounts for approximately 7% of the GDP of our country. So here you see how important it is. And to conclude, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference. this
господина Петра
ITF
Рамзауэра за
summit.
отличный
I would
прием
like to
и
thank
возможность
Mr.
пообщаться в рамках
Ramsauer
форума.
as our
Уверен, что
host,
такой
and I would
формат
like to thank him
полезен
for the
для
great
всех
conditions
министров
here
и
and the
всех
great
участников
possibility
нашего
to
форума,
communicate, to
поскольку дает
exchange
возможность
opinions.
обменяться
And I
самыми
think that this forum is very positive for all ministers involved in the ITF. We have a chance to exchange ideas about the most modern state-of-the-art approaches, even when it comes to investments, and that is great. Thank you.
I also have a planned intervention from Canada.
Thank you very much. First of all, for sure, I want to congratulate the Presidency of Norway and Dr. Ramsauer. That's always a pleasure to be in Germany with you. And we're very proud partners of ITF, and we will stay very good partners of ITF. Transport Canada is well committed and will stay there. And Canada is so proud to welcome two international civil aviation organizations in Montreal, two for IATA, and I will be there with you soon, but we're very proud to continue to work with our international partners. We have launched the biggest infrastructure plan of the Canada's history in the last budget, and we truly believe that has to be done in partnership. A country of our size with a small population of 34 million people of population have to do that with partners, with banking system and all private companies. And we will do that on that way. We already have very good results in Canada, and we will continue on that way. That's where our way of thinking. We have created P3 Canadas owned by the government, and any project over 100 millions done by the government have to go through the scope of P3s first of all before, if we see that's the best value for taxpayers' money. And we're using to the user-payer system. I know for aviation that's a bit more difficult, but we truly believe that people who use the service have to pay for it too. But we will continue to work with our international partners. We are here to learn, to share what we're doing, and we were very proud to be here with you at so well-organized summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Lebel. And I also have a planned intervention from Morocco.
Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier Madame la Présidente et
First
Monsieur
of
le
all,
Ministre pour cette
I would
invitation.
like to thank
C'est une
the
occasion
Chair
pour
and the German
saluer
Minister for this
le
invitation.
forum
For
pour
us,
ces
it is a
différentes
great
initiatives et je demande à ce qu'il
possibility, it
soit
is an
plus ouvert aux pays
opportunity
africains, en particulier le Maroc,
to
parce qu'on en a
welcome
besoin.
the
On a
initiatives of
déjà eu
this
l'occasion de
forum,
discuter avec
and
Monsieur le
our
Secrétaire
desire
Général.
is to open this forum
L'Afrique, c'est
even
un
further
marché
for
aujourd'hui en
Africa,
expansion.
especially for Morocco. We are happy to seize
Et
this
c'est un marché qui
opportunity.
a besoin d'un
We talked about
accompagnement
it
pour
with
qu'il
the
choisisse le
Secretary
meilleur
General
modèle
before. Africa is a
adapté au
growing
contexte
market, an
africain.
opening market, but
Et
also a
plus
market
particulièrement
that
le
needs to be
Maroc, qui est la
accompanied in
porte
order
de l'Afrique vers
to
l'Europe
choose
et
the
la porte
best
du monde
models, the
arabo-musulman
models
vers
best suited for the African
l'Occident et
continent
la
and
porte de l'Europe vers
Morocco.
l'Afrique. Donc on a
Morocco
besoin
is the
d'un
gateway
accompagnement
to the
pour qu'on puisse
African,
choisir
the
le meilleur
Muslim
modèle.
world, and
Donc
here we need
PPP,
to
le
be
meilleur modèle
accompanied,
pour
we need
bâtir
support
les
in order
infrastructures
to
de
choose
transport
the
dont on a
best
besoin.
models.
Je
PPP
dois,
as a model, for
c'est une
example,
occasion
for
pour moi
the
pour vous
transport
dire que nous
infrastructure
avons
models
choisi
that
donc
we need.
le
And this,
modèle
for me, is
PPP. Nous
also
avons
an
déjà préparé
opportunity
donc
to
une loi
say
qui est
that we
maintenant
have
en
decided
discussion
to
au
opt for
Parlement
the
marocain.
PPP
Donc elle va
model.
être
We have
adoptée très
passed
bientôt.
the
Et
according
pourquoi
law.
une loi?
That is,
Parce
it
qu'il faut
is
créer
still
une
in
confiance
Parliament
entre
and
le
will be
public et le
passed
privé.
in the
On
near
a besoin
future.
d'une confiance.
Why?
Parce que quand
Well,
même,
we
dans les
want to
pays
create
africains, on a
trust
des
between
expériences
the
dans ce qu'on
public and the
appelle
private
les
sector.
concessions, les gestions déléguées.
On
On a
the
beaucoup de
African
problèmes.
continent, there
Il y
are
a énormément
also
de problèmes. On n'a
examples
pas
of
d'institution d'arbitrage.
concessions,
On n'a
and
pas de
there were
système
many problems
d'intermédiation pour
involved
régler
in
les
that.
problèmes. Et on n'a
For example,
une
there is no
expérience pour gérer la
mediator,
gestion déléguée et
there
les
is
concessions.
no
Donc, pour le PPP, on aura
arbitration
besoin
for
de lois, on
these
aura besoin des
problems.
institutions,
And
on aura
hence, for
besoin
PPP, we
d'accompagnement de
need
la part
the
des grandes
laws in
institutions
place,
et
we
on
need
aura besoin à
institutions, and
apprendre
we
des
need to be
expériences des uns
accompanied
et des
by
autres
the
pour qu'on
larger
puisse
institutions.
avoir des
And
projets
we
et
also
comme ça
have
pour
to
délivrer dans des
learn
services
and
publics
benefit
qui
from
sont
the
adaptés
experiences
aux
of
citoyens.
others
Le
in
Maroc
order to be able to
aujourd'hui a
develop
une véritable stratégie en
projects
termes de
for the
transport.
public sector that are well suited for the citizens. In Morocco, we have a transport strategy that states that in the next 2 to 3 decades, we will make significant investments, and the results will also be set in the near future. We're talking about approximately an equivalent of 60 billion euros, by the way. and our budget is not sufficient. Hence, we need private money, national money, international funds for rail and road, but also for maintenance and repair, because it's also an important factor. We often tend to talk about new projects only, but not about maintenance, and this is something we also have to integrate in PPP models as well. We have to have maintenance projects there as well. Often, new constructions are valued, but then you forget about maintenance, and when it comes to PPP, we need to take into consideration the entire chain. There are different partner countries and partner companies, and they should also open themselves to the Moroccan and African market. We are here and we are willing to have success there. Our policy is open. We are open for private investors, and our market is a rather promising one. It's a future-oriented one, and it is a great opportunity for investors. The Moroccan market, we are willing to go further with you in a partnership.
Excellencies, we have time perhaps for one more intervention. If anybody would like to make a comment or a question, this is your moment, because we are coming slowly to the end of our session. Yes, please.
Thank you. I would like to ask Mr. David Fass his opinion of where we stand today with the PPPs in comparison of as before the crisis of 2009, when we experienced a very risk-prone atmosphere from commercial banks, capital and infrastructure funds, and after we had long queues of commercial banks trying to compete in the bidding processes. Afterwards, after 2009, this atmosphere disappeared. Now, at that time, we experienced risk-averse, and still we are far from returning to that age. I would like to hear his opinion of how he feels we are standing today and what should be done to regain confidence and attract the funding needed, and as we have heard, has become more difficult than in the past.
Yes, thank you. Thank you from Mexico. I think that the real difference between pre-2009 or really 2007, but let's call it 2009, the real difference between today goes back to that element of risk that we talked about before. I think developers, project sponsors, and equity investors historically have been trying to attract capital to achieve, let's call it, internal rates of return that were unrealistic for the types of risk that they were willing to take. And because that risk transfer mechanism got broken, I think the commercial banking industry got left with too much risk, and that contributed to some systemic failures of the banking industry. The banking industry continues to be in the spotlight of regulatory change. The risk appetite has necessarily come down significantly, and therefore the impetus that I was talking about with equity investors having to put in more capital to reduce the risk of PPP projects around the world, and I applaud some of the comments from Turkey and Tunisia earlier with respect to adopting that PPP model as they go into expanding the infrastructure in those countries. I think that the banking market is slowly coming back to understanding that it is a necessary component. I think that some of the international finance organizations are supporting the banking industry. The EIB, I know, is here in continuing to do that. But the real difference is there is more equity going into these projects. Project sponsors understand that it was too risky, the amount of capital that was being put onto some of these projects, debt capital that was being put on these projects, and I think that the PPP model is alive and well. It's just requiring more debt, and it's requiring long-term investors to take, it's requiring more equity, less debt, and investors across the spectrum having to settle for lower returns and probably lower risk, with some of that risk remaining in government hands for longer during the development phase. Hopefully that's helpful, and I'm happy to chat with you afterwards.
Thank you very much for that. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to wrap up our debate and this open ministerial session. Many, many thanks to all of our guest speakers for their very thought-provoking insights on what the private sector can do and indeed is already doing to ensure predictable funding for transport, and also on what you need from the public sector to do that even better. And I'd also like to thank all of our ministers for your contributions and for your attention. I warn you that you haven't quite seen the last of me, because in just a moment I will be giving you some instructions on our beloved tradition of the family photo, so I will be looking for your attention for just a while longer in a minute. But for now, I hand back to Minister Arnstad, and I hand back the microphone as well. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Melinda, and thank you for moderating this excellent exchange of views. Could I also, on behalf of my colleague ministers, extend a warm thanks to Mr. Fass, Mr. Shaw, and Mr. Cotil for your presence and and also for you sharing with us your perspective on funding transport. It has been most interesting. I would like to thank all ministers, all head of delegations, all of our guest ministers, and also head of international organizations that have been present with us today. It has been a pleasure both being preceding the closed session but also this open session. And I will thank you all for your presence and your participation with us today. I think you have now deserved your lunch. And I will give Melinda the possibility to say some words about the practical arrangement concerning lunch and also the family photo. Thank you very much. This session is now adjourned.
So I am now going to provide those instructions on the move, as it were, because you too, unfortunately, are all going to need to move so that we can do our family photo. The moment is now coming when we will start dismantling this table and the chairs, and I'm going to ask everyone in this segment of the room to please get up and remove all of your personal belongings. Our family photo, as you surely remember, takes place up here on the stage, but we have to do a brief rebuild. So please, all ministers, heads of delegation, advisory board, and keynote speakers, as well as panel speakers, please stay in the room for the group photo, but do clear this part of the room. All others, you may now leave for lunch. Make sure you've taken all your belongings with you as well. Photographers and camera teams, you should please leave the hall for a moment. We will let you back in when we're ready for that family photo. We're now going to start rebuilding the stage and the hall, so please rest assured this will occur very quickly, and I do thank you very, very much for your patience and your cooperation. And I'm going up on the stage so you can see me for further instructions.